Hello everybody. Today we're going to replace the stock 19 and 17 inch rims with a 21 front and an 18 inch rear wheel. So let's get started. When I started this project, I wanted to have an off-road wheel and an on-road wheel for the Ducati Desert Sled that I could switch between. And to do so, I found a available Cafe Racer hub, and I checked the part number and I went ahead and ordered it and built the wheel. Come to find out that the Cafe Racer hub is different than the Desert Sled hub. It's a little bit more narrow and it exposes the axle, and you can't just fix the problem with the bigger spacer because the spokes are right up against the caliper, and so it's probably not a good idea to run this hub. And I checked the part number again, and as you can see, the Cafe Racer number is one number different right in the middle of the sequence. So don't buy the Cafe Racer hub if you're gonna put the off-road wheel. And anyways, I found that the front wheel, the stock front wheel, was easy to take apart to fix this issue. And the nipples use the star torch pattern so they don't strip. So super easy to take apart. And now, relacing the stock hub into the new rim, I've marked inside and outside spokes, so it's much quicker. I didn't have to guess where to put them or try them out and see if it works good or not. And then I've written down the rotation and then also pointed the direction or the side of the rim at which the disc is going to go on. And then I have my truing stand set up, so we're going to have to true this again and get the tire back on it, and we can go back out and finish our installation. Now that I have the hub all laced up, I'm tightening each one of the nipples until the thread is no longer visible, and then once it's tightened to there, we're going to put it on the truing stand and true it. Now that the wheel is on the truing stand, we need to tighten the spokes, and we need to do it in a pattern where we tighten every fourth spoke to save us time, because if we just tighten them in order, then the spokes will pull the rim way out of true and it'll take more time. So I've numbered them 1 through 4, and you just go through and you tighten all the ones first, and then when you get through all the ones, you start over and you go through all the 2s, and then all the 3s, and then all the 4s. To true the rim, I have my point as close as I can get it, and I slowly rotate it, and if it goes too close to the left and I want to move it to the right, then I tighten the spokes on the right side to pull it away. Just do about a quarter turn at a time. If I want to drop the rim down to get lower to it, then wherever the point is that I want to drop, let's say it's right here, then I have to loosen these 3 to get it to drop. If it's between 2, then I have to loosen 4 to get it to drop in that spot. If you're doing this and the spokes are getting too tight for you to adjust them correctly to get the position you want, that means your spokes are all too tight, and be patient, loosen them all a little bit, and try the process again. And we're not trying to get the wheel tight yet, we're just trying to get it trued. And you can see I have it pretty close now. There's not much left to do. Maybe a little dip right here. So I have a dip right here, so I'm just gonna barely tighten these 3. And check it, and you can see it's gradually getting better. So you can see I got the rim pretty dang true. So now it's time to tighten it up. And you're supposed to tighten the spokes to 40 inch-pounds to 45 inch-pounds, which is about 5 Newton meters, which is not very much. If you don't know what that feels like, then you should get a spoke torque wrench that you can set to that value, but they're about $200, so I'm going to use this regular spoke wrench to tighten that amount. And remember, we want to tighten it up in that pattern, so all the ones first, then all the twos once you've gone all the way around, and then all the threes once you've gone all the way around, and then all the fours. And only tighten a quarter turn at a time until you get to that tightness. The rim is trued and tightened. The next thing to do is take a Dremel tool, and everywhere that the spokes stick up on the top side of the rim need to be sanded down, so that way when we have the tube and tire mounted, if you ever need to retighten the spokes, they don't poke through and pop the tube. All the spokes are shaved down. We're going to use a shop vac to clean out all of the metal shavings. So we're going to add our appropriate rim lock and just loosely put it on for now. We're going to add our rim strip to where the hole lines up with where the air inlet is going to go through. With that, our rim is complete. Now I'm off to the shop to get our tube and tire mounted. The front wheel will require no modifications to fit the taller 21-inch rim, but on the rear we're going to have to install fork extenders that are going to give about 3 inches of length. And to do this, we have to change quite a few things on the rear end. So one, we need a longer chain, and we're going to need a slightly bigger sprocket to keep the power ratio close to stock. The other thing we're going to have to do is we're going to have to reroute the brake line, because we're going to need a little bit more length to reach when this is back 3 inches. And the last thing that should be done is we need to change the license plate so that it's not in the way of the bigger wheel. So to show all the tools we're going to be using today, I'm using an ABBA stand to get lift, and you can see that I use some pavers to give some extra clearance, so that way we have plenty of space to work on the rear wheel. Then we have our 48 tooth sprocket, and then we have the stock size 15 tooth front sprocket, because you want to replace those two as a pair when you have a new chain. I also have a new license plate frame and different mounts that I'm going to try out to get the license plate propped up more so it's not in the way of the rear wheel. We have the Haynes manual. I'm going to have a digital caliper here so I can measure the slack on the chain when we have to do that, and then also make sure that the master link is on correctly. Then we have our 520 chain. We're using both thread locker blue, and then red's going to go on the fork extenders so that way they never come off. I have this master link tool, and then I'm using the Harbor Freight chain breaker, which works great. We need a 30mm socket for the rear, and I'm going to use this on the license plate. Then I have a breaker bar and a nice long torque wrench for the wheel axles. And here's one of the prize parts. So this is the Earl fork extender that's going to go on and extend that rear fork by about 3 inches. And then of course socket set with smaller torque wrench. So first thing I'm going to do is remove the chain with this chain breaker. Now that our chain is broken, we're going to go ahead and remove it and use the 30mm socket with a breaker bar and get the rear wheel off. Once you get the rear wheel off, make sure that you hang the rear brake caliper up so it's not hanging by its brake line, and I'm going to go ahead and use a zip tie to tie it up to this rear foot peg. Now that we have the caliper hung up on the rear passenger peg and it's not going to go anywhere and the rear wheel is out of the way, we're going to remove these adjusters. So I removed the rear fork adjusters and I cleaned with a contact cleaner. So now we can go ahead and try to insert our fork extenders. And you can see that this one mounts flush. However, my other fork extension, when I try to insert it, it will not go all the way through. It won't go completely flush here. So what they tell you to do is you need to take a router and you're gonna have to add a little bit of space here. And to know where you're gonna have to do it, you look at where the fork extender got bruised. So you can see I have 2 bruise marks on the bottom here. Yeah, right there. And so I'm gonna have to sand off the bottom just very, very slowly. Do a little bit at a time, try it. If it doesn't go in, take it out, do a little bit more until you get that nice flush fitting. To better help me find the spots on the fork that I need to shave, I painted the insert with a gold paint pen, and then I put it in, give it a few taps. You can see it's still not quite flush, but when I pull it out, you could see where all the gold markings are left, and that's where we shave with the router. And so we slowly shave those, put it back in, any more gold, put it back in, and it's slowly working its way towards flush. So I probably did about 20 rounds of painting this with gold, putting it in, bruising it, and then routing it very slowly and carefully. And you can see that I've gotten it pretty much flush, and more importantly, it's not going to move around. And the next thing we're going to do, we're going to put in the locking washers, so that's going to hold it snug, and bolt them in. And we're going to use our red thread locker because it's permanent and these things won't budge. And the instructions say to torque down the 2 bolts to 15 foot-pounds, which is about 20 Newton meters. And then this piece with the metal peg, it's going to go on the right side, and the peg is going to be where the manifold that has the caliper on it, it's going to slide into this peg instead of the slot up here. So we have our fork extenders installed, torqued down to 20 Newton meters, and we're going to put our chain adjusters back on, and they just slide right over, and just screw them in by hand, and we'll just leave them there for now. And I already got the other one on. So now we need to extend the brake line so that it's going to reach our new fork length, and you can see it comes out of the master cylinder right here, and it curls up underneath this panel, and then it comes back down the fork. So we have, seems like we have plenty of length. So I'm going to take off this panel, so 1 screw here and 2 down here, and then we'll see what we can do. Okay, so we have the side panel off, and you can see that from the master cylinder the brake line goes all the way up, and then it comes all the way back down, and it wraps around the frame and then goes down the fork. So it looks like the easiest way to reroute this and just get that 3 inches is we're going to have to drain the fluid, and we're going to remove this bolt, the banjo, and then pull it back, cut these zip ties here, unscrew this mount, and unwrap it and then have it go, instead of wrapping around, just go directly down. So we'll see how that goes. Alright, so the brake line is out. I was able to push it in through here and get it through on this side of the engine and then pull it out. And then here I had to take out the rubber grommet and pop it out from under and then pull it in through there. And it looks like the best way to route it now is to maybe go behind here, so we have the heat shield that will protect it, and then it'll come under and it should reach. So I'm gonna go ahead and try that. Okay, so now instead of the brake line going around here, we have it going around here instead, and we reach all the way to the rear there. So we have plenty of slack. So I slid the axle back in, and you can see that the brake line is just about the right length, and there's not a lot of play in it, so we don't have to worry about it hitting the rear tire. And we're gonna go ahead and put our cover back on and use those 3 bolts to bolt it back in. So I put the cover back on, tighten the bolts hand tight with some blue thread locker, and now we want to get extra clearance over that bigger tire, so we're going to remove the license plate frame. So now that we have the stock bracket off, you can see the mount comes down quite far here on the tail, and I have a new bracket that I'm going to use, and you can see it's too long, so we're going to go ahead and chop about an inch and a half off. So we used a square to mark a nice straight line, and we're going to go ahead and slowly cut it with the angle grinder. Now we're going to get rid of the pointy end of the tail, so we'll use the straight edge to mark, and we'll remove this bottom nut. So I've drawn a straight line where I'm going to cut, and I covered the rear end with plastic so that way we don't get any metal shavings where they're not supposed to be. Now that we've cut off the tip of the tail, we're going to use digital calipers to measure the spacing of the 2 nuts, and we're going to drill 2 holes in our new license plate bracket so that it will mount correctly. So before I start drilling my spots, I'm going to cause dimples with a hammer and punch, so that way my drill bits have somewhere to set. And I'm going to start out by using my smaller drill bits and slowly drilling and working my way up until the holes are big enough that the stock screws will fit through. And I'm going to use the router to sand the edges a little bit, get it nice and smooth. So I've cleaned it with isopropyl, and now I'm going to spray the tail end with some black paint and primer just to make sure that it doesn't rust. So now we're going to move our components, sprocket and disc, off of the stock wheel and put it onto the new wheel. And the first thing we're going to do is remove the stock sprocket and mount the new sprocket. And these are 15mm bolts, and you have to torque them down to 46 Newton meters, which is about 34 foot-pounds. It's very important to put 2 or 3 drops of thread locker blue on each of these bolts, and then we're going to tighten the nuts in a star pattern. And once you have the sprocket mounted, you can just pull that whole thing out of the cush drives. Now we're going to use an H5 Allen to remove the 6 bolts holding the rear disc and ABS ring from the wheel. So one of the brake bolts stripped when I was trying to remove it, so I used a 5/16 bit to drill until the head came off. And now I'm using a pair of vice grips and grabbing it and slowly turning out. Problem solved. So now that both my stock wheel and my new wheel both have the same parts on them, I want to check the weight, and I'm curious to see if our new wheel is lighter than the stock one. The stock wheel is 35.4 pounds and the new rim is 35.4 pounds. And now is an excellent time to clean all the rust off of your brake discs. I'm going to use a sponge and some brake cleaner. Now the disc is ready to be bolted back onto the rear wheel hub. And don't forget about the ABS ring. And I got new bolts from all the way from Italy. They were actually pretty cheap, and they have thread locker already on them. And they need to be tightened down to 25 Newton meters according to the manual. Now that our rear wheel is ready to be mounted, I'm going to go ahead and slide the axle back out, and I'm going to lightly grease it before we install it. I'm also going to put some grease inside of the hub just a little bit, just to make sure the grease goes through on both sides. And that should protect the areas where the metal moving parts make contact with each other, and then also keep the water out. But you don't want to use too much grease because you're going to attract dirt. Now we're ready to mount. I have the axle in enough to hold the brake manifold on, and with one arm I'm going to lift it up and line it, and the other arm I'm going to slide the axle through. Probably easier if you have a friend help you, but I'll try it by myself first. Now the rear wheel is on. We're going to use some brake cleaner, get this excess grease off of that part of the axle, and then we're going to lightly screw our axle nut on and not tighten it yet. First we're going to set our chain adjusters. I'm going to screw them all the way in and on both sides, and that's a 6mm adjuster screw there. And then we're going to get ready to mount our new chain. Now I'm going to change the front sprocket. You don't need to change your front sprocket if it's in good condition, but if your front sprocket is old, it's going to wear your new chain relatively quickly. So the first thing is to remove 3 H5 bolts for the plastic cover. And then unfortunately you have to remove the slave cylinder to get the clearance you need to pull the sprocket out, and you do not have to bleed your clutch slave cylinder. These are 3 H5 bolts. Once you remove that and get it out of the way, the front sprocket, instead of being held on by a traditional sprocket nut, it's held on by this lock washer that bolts directly onto the sprocket. And that needs to be removed by putting the bike in gear and screwing out these 8mm bolts. Now that everything's undone, that lock washer has these teeth on it, and you can just twist it and slide it out, and front sprocket is out. I've slid my new sprocket on. It's a super light sprocket, and you can see it has a rubber piece that goes all the way around, and the chain is supposed to sit on it, and it's supposed to be quieter, so we'll find out if that's really the case or if it's a gimmick. And then these lock washers, I read on the forums that they tend to wear out. You can see mine has a little bit of wear on it already, and if it wears out, the sprocket can move side to side and the chain can grind up all the guides and do a lot of damage. So I recommend replacing these every time. I went ahead and ordered 2 or 3 brand new ones just so every time I feel like it, I can change it out and keep this sprocket locked in place. Now I'm ready to bolt the retaining clip to the sprocket, and surprisingly the front sprocket retainer bolt only needs to be tightened to 6 Newton meters, which isn't very much, but we're also going to use thread locker red to really keep it from moving around, and you can see they use thread locker red from the factory as well. Now we can put the clutch slave cylinder back in place, and we'll bolt that on, and we'll leave the plastic cover off until we're done installing the chain. The chain comes extra greasy, so I'm going to open it up and wipe it off and then mount it, and we're gonna re-lubricate it when we're done anyways. I've mounted the chain, and while I like using the clip type master links more than these crush type ones, Ducati specifically says to use these master links. And if you crush them too much, they lock up and they won't move around. And I've crushed it just enough to get it started to hold the chain on, and it should be 5.5 millimeters in width. That's called the rivet flare, and you can see I have 5.0 millimeters, so I need to crush it a little bit more. And they say if you go 7 or above, it's too tight and this chain will be pinched and it won't move. So let's use our tool and flare those rivets just a little bit more. Now that my master link is correctly secure and the chain is not going to come off, I need to set my chain slack to the correct amount. And to do this, Ducati says that you need to have it on the side stand and set the slack to about 27 millimeters. But because we added a new sprocket, which is slightly larger, and then we also have our fork extenders, the chain is longer. And what I'm doing instead is compressing the fork with a jack, and then I'm gonna set the slack to 30 millimeters to start to see how that looks. And it's better to be slightly loose with the chain than it is to be tight. If you have it too tight, it's going to pull on the front sprocket and it can do a lot of damage. And to tighten the chain, we're going to screw our adjuster so that it moves the rear axle back, and pay attention to how many tick marks and do the same amount on the other side. So I've set the chain slack adjusters to about 3.5 on each side, and the slack is about 30 millimeters with the rear fork and the chain at its tightest position. And you can see that that gives enough wiggle room that it's not going to put any stress on the front sprocket, and it's tight enough that it's not going to come off the rear sprocket. So that is pretty good. The other thing you should check is look down the chain and kind of aim down it like the side of a gun and make sure it's not diagonal or going in a weird direction. You want it in a nice straight line, and that looks pretty solid. So now we're ready to tighten the axle. Now we're going to put some Loctite on our axle nut and then tighten it down to 145 Newton meters with our torque wrench, which is also 107 foot-pounds. And now is an excellent time to apply your favorite chain lubricant. So now we can install our license plate bracket on, and I had my buddy Dale bend this about 100 degrees, and then Mike Pacetta, he used a drill. In retrospect, 100 degrees is probably way too much, but I know that I have at least 1 inch of clearance, so I'm happy for now. I'll probably bend it back later. So the last thing to do on the rear wheel is to put that front sprocket cover back on, and that's just those 3 bolts. Not forget that we completely drained the rear brake when we removed the line and rerouted it, so we're going to have to fill it back up with brake fluid. And to do that, I have an 11 millimeter wrench on the nipple, and I have a clear line going to my waste bucket, and then we're going to put .4 brake fluid into the reservoir, and we're going to compress the brake, open the line, close the line, decompress the brake, compress the brake, open the line, close the line, and keep repeating that until we see fluid coming out of the line. And remember to keep topping off the reservoir so that we don't introduce air into the system, and to keep going until we can feel the disc being compressed. All we have to do to get the front wheel off is take out these pinch bolts on each side and then remove this front axle nut and pull it out. And I am lifting the front wheel off the ground using ABBA's front wheel lift attachment, where you use a ratchet strap on the rear to pull the front and it pivots around that jack point. With the pinch bolts out and the nut loosened, I'm just gonna hit it with my hand, and now the front axle is loose and we can pull it out and remove the front wheel. When I removed the front wheel, 2 spacers fell out on each side, and I'm just gonna leave them where they're at so I know which side they go on when I put the new wheel on. Now that I have the stock wheel off, I'm going to use a T40 star bit to remove the 5 bolts holding on the ABS ring and the front brake disc and move them over to our new front wheel. Now that we have the front brake disc and the ABS ring off of our stock wheel, we can check to see if our front 21-inch wheel that we're going to put on is lighter or heavier than the stock wheel. The stock wheel weighs 27.4 pounds. New wheel is 25.2 pounds. And we're going to use brake cleaner to clean our front disc. The ABS ring in place and the disc. And there are 5 bolts. They are a T40 Torx bit. And I put thread locker blue on each bolt, and I'm going to tighten them down to 30 Newton meters in a star pattern. Clean the front axle, and I'm going to apply a very light layer of grease on the whole thing. So we have the front wheel mounted. First thing I did was line up the disc with the caliper, and then we put the axle in, and this smaller spacer, the lip faces out, and then slide the axle through, and then the spacer on this side is symmetrical, so it'll fit facing either way, and we push it all the way through. And then before we can put the axle nut on, we have to hold the axle in place while we tighten down, or else it's going to rotate. And the manual says to use this tool to hold it from rotating, which I don't have, but what I do have is, this is a jack lever from one of the Harbor Freight jacks, and it fits just perfectly. So I'm going to use this, but if you didn't have a tool to hold it, the other thing you could do is tighten these clamp bolts to try and hold the axle in place, and then try tightening it. So once we have a way to hold the axle in place, we're going to use this axle nut, and I'm going to put some Loctite Red on the inside threading, and then we need to tighten it down, 30mm ratchet. We need to tighten it down to 63 Newton meters, which is about 46 foot-pounds. Our axle nut is tightened. The very last thing that we have to do is tighten these axle nut bolts. So I'm going to put a little drop of thread locker blue on each one, and then you're supposed to tighten them down to 10 Newton meters, and then we are done. So it looks totally awesome. One issue that you can see is that it is leaning pretty far over, and to fix that, I'm going to end up having to get a longer kickstand or get an extender for it. That concludes our install of the 21-inch front wheel and the 18-inch rear wheel. Now, a few things to say about this. First of all, if you notice at the beginning of the video, I'm clean shaven, and now at the end of this project, I have a beard. And that is to say that you should be patient when you are lacing and truing your rims. Make sure you get it right. You also want to make sure you get your chain tension right. The second thing I want to say is that this build is not cheap. The Earl rear fork extender, those cost $425, which is quite a bit, considering that, you know, normal dirt bike fork extenders are about $250. But when I got the parts, they're billeted aluminum, they're absolutely beautiful, and I would highly recommend them. Secondly, the W rims and spokes. So they take W, which is in Corona, California, they take these rims and they custom drill them, and then they custom cut the spokes to fit to the stock hubs, and that cost about $745. The cool thing is you can send them your hubs and they will lace and true the rims for you, which will save you hours if you don't want to do it yourself. The chain and sprockets cost $211, and the tires, which I got these 70/30 Pirelli Scorpions, they were $356. So the total cost was $2,037. Now the plus is you can take your stock rims and spokes and sell them and get anywhere between $1,200 and $1,800 back if they're in good condition. So that can save you on some of the cost here. The second thing I want to go over is performance. So we went to a 19-inch front that was 3 inches wide to a 21-inch tall 1.85, so taller and skinnier, and then the rear 17-inch 4.5 wide to a taller 18-inch 2.5-inch skinnier. So taller and skinny wheels, they will roll over obstacles better, and they will go through sand and mud much better than those wider tires do. In fact, the stock front wheel, first time I hit deep sand in it, I almost got thrown because it just dug into the sand and was not that great. So the other major advantage, the wheelbase is now longer. Originally it was 59.3 inches, now it is 62.3 inches, give or take. And the ground clearance, the best thing about this is the ground clearance, 7.9 inches stock. Now we have 8.9 inches of ground clearance, which is just awesome. So all those combined stats mean to me that this is the single best upgrade you can do to make the Ducati Desert Sled better off-road. One of the negatives is that the seat height, so the stock seat height is 33.9, now it's up to 34.9 inches. And that's tall enough that I'm 5'10", I have a 32-inch inseam, I'm on the balls of my feet now. And that's okay for an off-road motorcycle. That's the sacrifice you should be making to get better suspension and travel. But if that is too tall for you, you could get a shorter seat, or taller wheels might not be something that you want to do. The last thing I want to say, which is the most obvious thing I think, is that these wheels make this bike look absolutely beautiful. Same with the rear fork extenders. I love it. I think it looks great. Took a long time to do this, and it's certainly paid off. And thank you for watching this video. If you would like to see more, please subscribe, and you'll get to see my first impressions of riding it.